Clara's day started off terribly. A pounding headache throbbed in her temples, and all she longed for was to be far away from the noisy office, perhaps by a cool river or the sea. She imagined the gentle waves rolling onto the shore, the warm sun caressing her shoulders, and, for a brief moment, she felt a bit more at ease. But there was no time for daydreaming. Her boss was waiting for the quarterly report. Clara was his favorite, the most responsible and punctual among his employees, practically his right hand. However, this unspoken title brought her no comfort. Instead, it weighed heavily on her shoulders, constantly reminding her of the immense responsibility she carried. Suddenly, the office door swung open and her assistant Emily stepped in. "A visitor is here to see you regarding a personal matter." Clara frowned in surprise. "Strange. I'm not expecting anyone. All right, let her in." She straightened her posture, discreetly adjusted her hair, and slipped her feet back into the shoes she had kicked off under the table for a moment of relaxation. A woman, seemingly 10 years younger than Clara, walked into the office with a defiant gaze. "My name is Sophie." She introduced herself before boldly declaring, "I'm here to tell you to leave Max alone." Every word echoed unpleasantly in Clara's head, but she maintained her composure. "How exactly am I bothering him? And why should I leave my own husband?" She asked calmly, though the audacity of the stranger's demand startled her. "Because you're holding on to him. You're not young anymore, and he only stays with you out of pity." "But he loves me," Sophie exclaimed, her voice trembling with emotion. Gasping for breath, she proceeded to explain that she was an orphan who had fallen deeply in love with Max, Clara's husband. According to Sophie, Max felt the same way but was unable to be with her because of Clara, who refused to let him go, allegedly citing an incurable illness or some other excuse. Sophie painted a picture of a tormented man, torn between duty and love. "Besides, we're expecting a baby," Sophie suddenly shouted, her voice so loud that the entire office must have heard. "Step aside. Don't deprive this child of a father. You're getting old. Why hold on to a man who stays with you out of guilt? Let him go. He deserves to be happy." Clara couldn't hide her astonishment. She was certainly hurt by Max's betrayal, especially since their 10th wedding anniversary was approaching. But on the other hand, the situation seemed almost comical to her. "Don't worry, I'll talk to my husband today. It's probably time for me to move into a retirement home anyway. He still has his whole life ahead of him," Clara said with a smirk, watching Sophie's confused expression. After Sophie left, Clara leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and sighed heavily. She and Max had been married for a decade, initially prioritizing their careers over children. A few years ago, they finally decided to start a family, but it never happened. Clara assumed it was due to stress from their demanding jobs. However, she decided to check their health, and just yesterday, she had picked up their test results. The report clearly stated that Max was infertile. Sophie's claim about her pregnancy unexpectedly amused Clara. More than anything, she now wanted to confront her husband and see his reaction. Citing poor health, Clara left work early and went home. The moment she stepped into the house, Max spoke first. "We need to have a serious talk." "Oh, I know," Clara replied. "Sophie came to see me today." Max's expression froze. "Sophie came to you?" "Oh, yes. Your mistress paid me a visit. She told me I'm too old for you and that I should set you free. She also mentioned she couldn't resist your charm and is now expecting your child." "Clara, don't be like this. Yes, I made a mistake, but I never planned to leave you. We've been through so much together. Sophie is just young and naive. She didn't mean to hurt you. If she offended you, I'll talk to her and make her apologize." Clara felt her anger rise. Not only did his mistress have the nerve to come to her workplace and say such things, but Max actually expected her to tolerate it. "Do you even hear yourself?" she snapped. "I don't need her apologies, and I certainly don't need your presence in this house. Pack your things and leave." before I create a real scandal." Max lowered his head and walked away to pack. Standing at the doorway with his suitcase, he hesitated for a moment before making one last attempt. "Clara, let's not act rashly. Maybe we can fix this. I still love you." Clara gave him a cold smile. "Dear husband, I've said all I need to say. Besides, what are you talking about? You have a child on the way." Max sighed heavily. "Oh, yes, the child." He then nodded. "You're right. It's better if I go." As he opened the door, Clara suddenly called out to him. She handed him the test results and advised him to read them carefully before slamming the door in his face. She could hear him standing there, likely struggling to understand what was written on the document. When he finally realized the truth, his hysterical screams filled the hallway. He pounded on the door in desperation. "Clara, what does this mean? Explain." "That's not my question to answer, Max. Let your darling Sophie explain who the real father of her child is. Now leave me alone," Clara shouted from the other side of the door. Hearing Max call the elevator and leave, she suddenly felt a twinge of sympathy for him. But the feeling quickly faded. He wasn't worth it. Exhausted from the day's events, Clara went into the guest room, curled up under a warm, fluffy blanket, and finally allowed herself to cry. The pain of betrayal was unbearable. She reminisced about how she had first met Max nearly 12 years ago. Back then, he was a clumsy, nearsighted medical student who had accidentally knocked a box out of her hands on the street. Despite his nervous stuttering, she had helped him believe in himself. Over time, he transformed into a confident, successful doctor. Her friends had envied her, but Clara had believed in his love. His betrayal had drained the last of her strength, affecting her work. Noticing her distress, her boss, a fair and understanding man, insisted she take a vacation by the sea. Clara chose a quiet, secluded place far from noisy resorts. For the first few days, she simply lay on the beach, soaking up the sun, enjoying the gentle sea breeze and listening to the soothing sound of the waves. But soon, boredom crept in, and she started observing other vacationers. Her attention was particularly drawn to a young man, about 25, who ran toward the waves with childlike enthusiasm, playing with the children on the shore. "What a strange guy," Clara thought. "Is he seeing the sea for the first time? He acts like a little kid." Though his behavior baffled her, it also intrigued her. His carefree energy reminded her of her own childhood, when she, too, had allowed herself to be spontaneous. That evening, feeling a bit melancholic, Clara went to a nearby bar, where she unexpectedly ran into the same young man. And so, her story took another turn. She couldn't fathom how she had managed to live this way before. By morning, the haze of passion and alcohol had lifted, allowing Clara to see things with stark realism. She acknowledged that these affairs had no future. Yes, they were thrilling, but that was all. Everyone had to return to their ordinary lives. Clara cautiously slipped out from under the covers, left Luke's room, and gathered her belongings before quietly departing from the hotel. That morning, guilt gnawed at her. Luke didn't deserve such an abrupt exit, yet she felt she had no other choice. On the way home, Clara found herself breaking into tears, unsure of the reason. At work, she buried herself in paperwork, attempting to suppress her loneliness. But in the evenings, her mind wandered back to the sunlit beach and the cheerful young man playfully diving through the waves. At times, Clara regretted not leaving Luke her phone number or address, but she convinced herself that a relationship with a modest mechanic wouldn't have worked out anyway. She had tried meeting new people through social media and even went on a few dates, but the hollow conversations about luxury vacations, high-end cars, and material wealth failed to captivate her. Her thoughts persistently drifted back to Luke. Max had attempted to re-enter her life multiple times. After the DNA test confirmed that the child wasn't his, he had broken up with Sophie. Can you believe it? She wasn't even an orphan. She deceived me all along, he complained to Clara. Forgive me. We were great together. Let's start over. Max, I lost interest in you a long time ago, Clara responded coolly. I suggest you find a decent woman and build a life with her. Let me sort out mine. I'll never forgive your betrayal, especially now that I see you for what you truly are, far from an honest man. And frankly, you weren't even that great in bed. Max was stunned by her blunt words, convinced she was retaliating out of spite, hitting him where it hurt most. But Clara meant every word. After her night with Luke, she realized her marriage had never been built on genuine emotion. It's uncertain how Clara's life would have unfolded if not for her assistant, Emily. Over time, the two had become close friends, often meeting at cafes after work and spending weekends bowling or ice skating. As the sweltering summer heat set in, the oppressive atmosphere of the noisy, suffocating city began to weigh on Clara. Her migraines returned, and her reluctance to spend all day in the office only to return to her stifling apartment grew stronger. Emily, I feel completely drained, she admitted to her friend. Let's get away for the weekend. Somewhere near a river or a lake. I swear, I'll stay in the water until it's time to leave. Then let's go to my grandmother's, Emily suggested excitedly. She lives in a small town, surrounded by a river and a forest. Clara hesitated at first, feeling like an intruder in Emily's family home. But Emily reassured her that her grandmother was incredibly welcoming. Eventually, Clara agreed. They arrived at Mrs. Foster's house on Friday evening to find the elderly woman waiting for them in the garden, a table set with food. Though they initially declined a late-night meal, Mrs. Foster would hear none of it. Nothing will happen to your figures. You'll swim tomorrow. It's excellent exercise, she chuckled. Yeah, sure. Except I don't know how to swim. Emily laughed. What? Clara gasped in surprise. I thought we'd race each other to the opposite shore tomorrow. Emily waved her hands in protest. Forget it. That river is treacherous. The icy underground currents are dangerous. Even the strongest swimmers in town don't dare cross it. Clara scoffed, assuming Emily was just being overly cautious. But when Mrs. Foster echoed the warning, Clara was more intrigued than deterred. Determined to prove her courage, Clara woke early the next morning while Emily was still asleep. She slipped into her swimsuit, threw on a light robe, and ran down to the river. A thin mist hovered over the water, lending an air of serenity. Enchanted by the scenery, she plunged into the invigorating coolness of the river. With powerful strokes, she soon reached the middle and felt an overwhelming sense of calm. Where's the danger in this? She scoffed, setting her sights on the opposite shore. But within moments, the frigid currents tightened around her limbs. Crippling cramps seized her muscles, and panic surged through her as she desperately screamed for help. She knew, deep down, that at this hour, no one would hear her. Her strength waned, and she lost consciousness. When Clara came to, she was lying on the shore. She learned that a man fishing nearby had heard her cries and rushed to her rescue. If not for his early morning fishing trip and knowledge of CPR, that morning might have been her last. But this wasn't the only twist of fate. Blinking in disbelief, she looked at her savior. Luke, is that you, or am I imagining things? Yes, Clara, it's me. His voice was filled with both relief and curiosity. How did you end up here? And why did you disappear that morning? Did I do something wrong? Clara, flustered, admitted shyly, I've never felt as good with anyone as I did with you. I was just scared. An hour later, they sat on the spacious terrace of his home, savoring apple pie and sipping tea. Son, aren't you going to introduce us? Mrs. Beasley teased her son. This is Clara, my fiancée, Luke announced confidently. Clara choked in shock. Excuse me? She arrived yesterday and stayed with Mrs. Foster, Mrs. Beasley mused. Why wouldn't she stay here? Luke smoothly replied. Clara follows strict principles. She refuses to live under the same roof with her fiancé before marriage, which is why I think we need to get married as soon as possible. Clara whispered in protest, And you didn't think to ask me first. Didn't you already agree? Luke grinned. We're filing the application the day after tomorrow. Mum, I think she's just overheated from the sun. Mrs. Beasley chuckled. I thought so. A month later, a grand wedding took place in the town. Luke adored Clara, and she eagerly anticipated every moment she would spend alone with the man she had grown to love so deeply. 9 months later, Clara gave birth to their son. Reflecting on how one scandalous incident had changed the course of her life, she smiled. I should probably thank Sophie, she mused, cradling the child born from the love of her life.